The silence in the house was the first thing Arthur noticed in the mornings and the last thing he heard at night. It had been 6 months since Clara passed, but the silence remained a stubborn, unwelcome guest. It clung to the heavy velvet curtains she had picked out and pulled in the empty armchair across from his. Clara had been the source of all the home's gentle noises, the hum of her singing as she watered the geraniums, the soft clatter of her teacup in its saucer, the rustle of a newspaper page turning. Now, the old house on Chestnut Street only echoed with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, a sound that no longer measured time but marked its relentless, empty passage. Arthur, a man of 72 whose hands had spent 50 years shaping wood into beautiful, functional things, felt utterly useless. His workshop in the back of the garden sat dormant, the scent of cedar and sawdust growing faint. Grief was not a thing he could sand down or varnish over. It was a knot in the grain of his own being, and he didn't have the tools to carve it out. This particular Tuesday started like all the others. He made a single cup of coffee, staring out the kitchen window at the bird bath Clara had adored. It was time. He had been putting it off, this final, terrible task, sorting through her things. Her closet was the final frontier, a sanctuary of her scent lavender and old books that he had kept sealed like a tomb. He opened the door and the scent washed over him, a phantom embrace. He started with her shoes, lining them up with a precision that felt absurd. Then her dresses, their floral patterns a ghostly garden in the dim light. At the very back of the closet, on the top shelf beneath a stack of neatly folded winter blankets, his fingers brushed against something hard, wood. He pulled it down. It was a box, about the size of a shoebox, made of a dark, rich mahogany he didn't recognize. The joinery was exquisite, a series of intricate dovetails so seamless they looked like they had grown that way. But the most peculiar thing was the carving on the lid, a delicate, intertwining pattern of ivy and what looked like morning glories, and it was locked. A small ornate brass lock with no key in sight. Arthur ran his calloused thumb over the smooth wood. He had built most of the furniture in this house. He knew every grain, every joint, every imperfection. He had never, in their 48 years of marriage, seen this box before. Clara was not a woman of secrets. Her life was an open book, one he thought he had read cover to cover 100 times. A cold knot of confusion tightened in his chest, a feeling so alien it briefly eclipsed his grief. Where did this come from? And what, in God's name, was inside? He spent the rest of the morning searching for a key. He checked her jewelry box, the small porcelain dish on her dresser where she kept odds and ends, the junk drawer in the kitchen, nothing. The box sat on the dining room table, a silent testament to a part of his wife he had never known. By afternoon, his frustration had morphed into a quiet desperation. He couldn't bring himself to break it open. The craftsmanship was too beautiful, and more than that, it felt like a violation of her memory. He needed a different kind of expert. He remembered a small shop downtown, a place Clara had sometimes visited tucked away on a side street. Elias' Son, Antiques and Restoration. Though old Mr. Elias had passed years ago, his son, or perhaps grandson, had kept it going. Arthur carefully wrapped the box in a soft towel, placed it in a canvas bag and left the quiet house behind. The bell above the shop door chimed a delicate, silvery note as he stepped inside. The air smelled of beeswax, old paper, and something else, chamomile tea. The place was a beautiful, cluttered wonderland of forgotten treasures. Grandfather clocks stood silent sentinel, their pendulums still. Porcelain dolls with vacant eyes stared from dusty shelves. A woman stood behind a large oak counter, her back to him, carefully polishing a silver locket. She had silver gray hair tied in a loose, elegant bun at the nape of her neck, and she wore a simple linen apron over a dark green dress. She didn't seem to have heard him come in. "Excuse me," Arthur said, his voice sounding rough in the quiet space. The woman turned, and for a moment, Arthur felt a strange jolt of recognition, though he was certain he'd never seen her before. She had kind eyes, the color of moss after a rain, etched with fine lines at the corners. There was a calmness about her, a stillness that reminded him of the deep woods. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice soft and measured. "How can I help you?" Arthur placed the canvas bag on the counter and gently unwrapped the box. The woman's eyes widened slightly as she saw it. She didn't reach for it immediately, but leaned forward, her gaze tracing the intricate carvings on the lid. "It's beautiful," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "My wife's," Arthur explained. "I found it this morning. It's locked, and I can't find a key. I was hoping you might be able to open it without damaging it." The woman finally looked up from the box and met his eyes. A flicker of something unreadable passed through her expression, curiosity, perhaps, but something else too, something deeper. "I can certainly try," she said. She reached out and ran a delicate finger over the dovetail joints, a touch so light it was almost a caress. "This is remarkable work. The wood is Cuban mahogany, very old, and this inlay, it's a very specific style." Arthur watched her, intrigued. "You recognize it?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her gaze dropping back to the box. "I've seen similar craftsmanship before. It's rare. The artisan who made this had a very unique signature." She straightened up, her professional demeanor returning. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I can't make any promises, but I have a set of professional clockpicks and a gentle hand. I'll need to keep it for a day or two if that's all right. Arthur felt a pang of reluctance at the thought of leaving it. This last mystery of his wife's. But he looked at Eleanor's steady hands and her calm, knowing eyes, and he trusted her. That's fine, he said. Take your time. He gave her his name and phone number as he turned to leave. Eleanor spoke again, her voice quiet. This box, it feels important. Arthur paused at the door, his hand on the brass handle. He looked back at her, standing in her shop full of other people's memories, a gentle guardian of things left behind. Everything about her was important, he said, and stepped back out into the afternoon sun, the silence of his own life waiting for him. The next 2 days were a peculiar form of torture for Arthur. The empty space on the dining room table where the box had sat seemed to pulse with a silent question. He found himself imagining all sorts of things inside, old love letters from a beau before him. He dismissed the thought as quickly as it came. His and Clara's love story was simple, straightforward. They had met at a town dance when he was 20 and she was 18. There was no one before, no one after. Perhaps it held some family heirloom from her side, something she'd never mentioned. Her parents had died when she was young, and she rarely spoke of them. The not knowing was worse than any possible truth. He busied himself in the garden, pulling weeds with a vengeance, trying to tire his body so his mind would quiet down. On the third day the phone rang. It was Eleanor. Mr. Hayes, she said, her calm voice a balm on his frayed nerves. I have some news. I was able to open the box. Arthur's heart hammered against his ribs. And I think it would be best if you came down to the shop, she said gently. I don't think this is a conversation for the phone. An hour later, he was standing once more in the quiet, fragrant antique shop. Eleanor greeted him with a small, sympathetic smile and led him to a small sitting area in the back, furnished with 2 worn velvet armchairs and a small table. The box was on the table, its lid now slightly ajar. I want you to know, Eleanor began, sitting across from him, that I did not pry. As soon as the lock turned, I closed it and waited for you. Whatever is in there is for your eyes only. Arthur nodded, his throat tight with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Thank you. I appreciate that. He reached for the box, his hands trembling slightly. He hesitated, took a deep breath, and lifted the lid. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't this. The box was lined with faded blue silk, and nestled inside were not jewels or letters, but 3 simple, baffling items. The first was a single, perfectly pressed flower. Its petals were a deep, vibrant blue, almost purple, an iris. Beneath it lay a child's drawing, the paper yellowed and brittle with age. It depicted a tall, white lighthouse on a cliff with a bright yellow sun in the corner. The waves were drawn as a series of cheerful blue squiggles. There were 2 stick figures on the cliff, one larger than the other, holding hands. The third item was a small, tarnished brass key, the kind used for a post office box, tied with a faded red ribbon. Arthur stared at the contents, a profound sense of dislocation washing over him. This meant nothing. It was a collection of sentimental trifles that had absolutely no connection to his life with Clara. Clara, who was allergic to irises. Clara, who was a realist and had little patience for childish drawings. Clara, who had never once mentioned a lighthouse. He picked up the key, turning it over in his palm. It felt heavy like a secret. Does any of this mean anything to you? Eleanor asked softly, her voice pulling him from his reverie. Arthur shook his head, placing the key back in the box. No, nothing at all. It's like it belonged to someone else. He looked at the drawing again. In the bottom right corner, in a child's clumsy print, was a single initial L, Nazi for Clara. He felt a sharp, unexpected pang of something that felt like jealousy or betrayal. It was an ugly, unwelcome emotion. For 48 years, he had believed he was the sole keeper of his wife's heart, the curator of her memories. Now, this box suggested a hidden gallery, a secret wing of her life he never knew existed. The key might be a place to start, Eleanor suggested, pointing to the small brass object. It looks like a standard P. Oh, box key. There's a number etched on it. It's very faint. Arthur picked it up again and held it to the light. She was right. Stamped into the metal was the number 317. The main post office downtown still has some of the old boxes, Eleanor said. It's possible it's still active, or if not, they might have a record of who it belonged to. The idea of taking action, of doing something other than stewing in his own confusion, was a lifeline. Will you come with me? The words were out before he could stop them. He felt a blush creep up his neck. It was a forward thing to ask of a stranger, but Eleanor didn't seem to find it odd. She looked from Arthur's face to the box, and a look of deep compassion softened her features. She saw a man adrift, and the box was his only map. Of course, she said simply. I'll close the shop for an hour. The post office was a grand, imposing building of marble and brass, a relic from an era when sending a letter was an event. The section with the post office boxes was quiet, a wall of hundreds of small brass doors. They found the 300 section and scanned the numbers. There it was, 317. Arthur's hand shook as he inserted the key. He half expected it not to turn, for this to be another dead end. but with a soft click, the lock disengaged. He pulled the small door open. The box was not empty. Inside was a thick stack of envelopes, tied together with the same faded red ribbon that had been on the key. They were old, the paper soft and worn at the edges. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. He carefully lifted the bundle out. He looked at the top envelope. The postmark was faded, but he could make out the year 1968, 4 years before he and Clara had even met. The letter was addressed not to Clara, but to a man named Daniel, and the return address simply listed a name Lena. Arthur stood there in the quiet hall of the post office, holding a stranger's love letters, his mind reeling. Clara hadn't had a secret lover. She had been a secret keeper. The relief was so profound it almost buckled his knees. But it was immediately replaced by 1,000 new questions. Who were Lena and Daniel? And why had his wife been the guardian of their story for over 50 years? He looked over at Eleanor. She was watching him, her expression unreadable but intense, as if she was seeing a ghost from her own past. It was then that Arthur noticed the small, silver locket she was wearing, the one he'd seen her polishing. It was shaped like a flower, a blue iris. They took the letters back to Eleanor's shop. The afternoon sun streamed through the front window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air like tiny, golden sprites. Eleanor made them both a cup of tea, the fragrant steam of chamomile and honey filling the quiet space between them. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Arthur sat in the worn velvet armchair, the bundle of letters resting on his lap. It felt sacrilegious to open them, like eavesdropping on a conversation that had ended half a century ago. "You don't have to read them," Eleanor said softly, as if sensing his hesitation. "We could just put them back in the box. Some stories aren't meant to be finished." But Arthur knew he couldn't do that. This story was tangled up with his wife's. Understanding it felt like a way of understanding a part of Clara he had never been allowed to see. It was a final conversation with her, albeit a one-sided one. "She kept them for a reason," he said, his voice raspy. He carefully untied the faded red ribbon. The letters were not in chronological order. He picked one from the middle of the stack. The handwriting was feminine and elegant. The ink a faded blue. "My dearest Daniel," it began. "The light from your tower was the last thing I saw before I fell asleep last night, and the first thing I looked for this morning. It feels like a promise, a beacon calling me home. Father was in one of his moods again yesterday. He spoke of my duty, of the respectable match he has arranged. The words were like stones in my pocket weighing me down. He doesn't see me, Daniel. He only sees a daughter to be married off, a piece in his game. But when I'm with you I feel seen. You see Lena, not just the daughter of Thomas Blackwood. I am counting the minutes until our meeting on Saturday. I will wear the blue dress you like. Forever yours, Lena." Arthur put the letter down, his mind working to piece together the fragments. A lighthouse, a domineering father, a secret love. It was a story as old as time. He looked up at Eleanor, who was watching him with an unnerving intensity. "Does the name Thomas Blackwood mean anything to you?" he asked. Eleanor's teacup rattled softly in its saucer. She set it down with deliberate care. "He was a very powerful man in his time," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Shipping mostly. He owned half the docks in Port Anne, about a 3-hour drive from here. He was known for being ruthless, in business and, some said, in his personal life. He passed away years ago." Port Anne. The name resonated with a faint, distant familiarity. Clara had a cousin who lived near there, someone they had visited a handful of times in the early years of their marriage. He picked up another letter. This one was more joyful. "Daniel, you were right. We can do it. We can leave this place behind. Your plan is daring, but it feels right. I have been slowly putting aside a little money for my allowance. It isn't much, but it's a start. I packed a small bag today, with my favorite book and the drawing you made me of the lighthouse. It felt so real, so hopeful. I imagine us somewhere new, where the name Blackwood means nothing. A small cottage by the sea, a garden of our own. Is it foolish to dream so vividly? You make me brave. My love, all my heart, Lena." The drawing of the lighthouse. The one from the box. It wasn't a child's drawing. It was a keepsake, a symbol of a dream. Arthur felt a growing sense of kinship with these two long-lost lovers. Their hope and their fear felt so palpable, so alive, right here in this dusty antique shop. He read on for over an hour, Eleanor sitting in silent companionship. The story unfolded. Daniel was a lighthouse keeper in Port Anne, a man of simple means but deep integrity. Lena was the sheltered daughter of a tyrant. Their love was a rebellion, a desperate bid for freedom. The final letters grew more urgent, filled with the hushed, frantic energy of an escape plan coming to fruition. They had set a date. Lena was to pack a single bag, meet Daniel at the base of the lighthouse at midnight, and they would take a bus heading west, disappearing into a new life together. The last letter in the stack was dated October 12, 1968. "My love," it read, "tonight is the night. My bag is hidden. My heart is pounding so hard I'm sure the whole house can hear it. I am terrified, and I have never been more certain of anything in my life. By the time the sun rises, we will be free. I am thinking of the promise you made me, that one day we would plant a garden filled with blue irises. A whole field of them just for us. Hold that thought for me. See you at midnight. Your Lena. Arthur folded the letter and placed it back on the stack. A profound sadness settled over him. He knew, with a grim certainty, that the plan had failed. Otherwise, why would these letters be here? In a locked box in his wife's closet, Lena and Daniel had never gotten their cottage by the sea, their garden of irises. Something went wrong, he said, the words heavy in the quiet room. Eleanor, who had been staring out the window, turned to him. There were tears glistening in her moss-green eyes. They never made it. It wasn't a question. Clara must have known them, Arthur mused, trying to connect the dots. She must have been Lena's friend, her confidant. Lena must have given her the box for safekeeping before she ran away. Or, Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper, Clara was supposed to give the box to Daniel if something happened to Lena. The thought was like a punch to the gut. If that were true, it meant his quiet, gentle Clara had carried the weight of this failed love story, this broken promise. For her entire life she had never delivered the message. Why had she been unable to find Daniel? Or was the story even darker than that? Port Anne, Arthur said, the name solidifying in his mind. The lighthouse. It must still be there. He looked at Eleanor, a wild, impulsive idea forming. I have to go. He needed to see the place where this story had unfolded. He needed to stand on that cliff and look at that tower. It felt like the only way to get closer to the truth. To get closer to the woman his wife had been before he met her. I'll drive you, Eleanor said, her voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Arthur looked at her, surprised. You don't have to do that. I know, she said, her gaze steady and unwavering, but I think I do. Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that Arthur didn't understand. It felt as if this journey was just as much for her as it was for him. As he prepared to leave the shop, his eyes once again fell on the silver iris locket around her neck. He finally asked the question that had been hovering in the back of his mind. Your locket, he said, it's an iris. Just like the pressed flower in the box. Eleanor's hand went to the locket. Her fingers closing around it protectively, she gave him a sad, enigmatic smile. My mother always told me it was my flower, she said softly. She said it symbolized hope and wisdom and a promise. She gave this to me just before she died, and with that, she turned to lock the front door, leaving Arthur standing in the fading light. A cold shiver running down his spine, the initial L on the drawing. Lena, his mind made a leap it wasn't prepared for, a conclusion that was both impossible and, suddenly, terrifyingly plausible. The 3-hour drive to Port End was a journey through rolling green hills and sleepy, forgotten towns. Arthur drove his old, comfortable sedan, a car that still faintly smelled of Clara's gross-scented hand lotion. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, mostly silent, her gaze fixed on the passing landscape. The silence between them wasn't empty, like the silence in Arthur's house. It was filled with the weight of the letters, with unspoken questions and a shared sense of pilgrimage. Arthur kept glancing over at her, since her comment about the locket. He couldn't shake the impossible thought that had taken root in his mind. Lena, Eleanor, the names were different, but the echoes were there. Her mother who loved irises, her quiet, old-soul wisdom. It was absurd. If her mother was Lena, who was the man she spoke of? The powerful, ruthless Thomas Blackwood, surely not her father. As they drew closer to the coast, the air began to change. It grew heavy with salt and the sharp, wild scent of the ocean. The sky opened up, a vast canvas of pale blue, and then they saw it, rising from a distant, rocky promontory, a stark white pillar against the horizon, the Port End lighthouse. Arthur's hands tightened on the steering wheel. It was exactly as he had imagined from the letters. A lonely, defiant sentinel standing guard over the churning sea. He followed a winding coastal road that led towards it, the tires crunching on the gravel of a small windswept parking lot. They got out of the car. The wind was strong here, whipping Eleanor's silver-gray hair around her face and carrying the cries of gulls. They walked towards the cliff edge, the rhythmic crash of waves against the rocks below a constant, powerful percussion. The lighthouse stood before them, magnificent and melancholic. Its white paint was peeling in places, and a patina of rust stained the iron of the walkway at its top. But it stood strong. He would have seen her coming from up there, Arthur said, his voice nearly carried away by the wind. He would have been watching for her. They stood there for a long time, two strangers bound by a 50-year-old secret, staring at the monument to a love that never was. There was a small, weathered plaque near the base of the tower. Port End Lighthouse, established 1887, automated 1972, automated, so there had been no keeper here for decades. Daniel would have been the last or one of the last. I wonder what happened to him, Arthur said. Did he just leave? Did he ever try to find her? Maybe he thought she never showed up. Eleanor suggested, her voice thin. Maybe he thought she changed her mind. The thought was a cruel one. A man waiting all night for the woman he loved, only to be met with silence in the dawn. A lifetime of wondering why. They walked along the cliff path, the sea spray misting their faces. The wild, untamed beauty of the place was intoxicating, but it was all tinged with the sadness of the story it held. As they rounded a bend, they came upon a small, secluded cove, a pocket of calm amidst the churning waters. A rickety set of wooden stairs lead down to a small patch of sandy beach. Eleanor stopped dead. Her face went pale and her hand flew to her mouth. Arthur looked at her concerned. Eleanor, are you all right? She didn't seem to hear him. She was staring at the cove with a look of stunned, painful recognition. She took a few unsteady steps towards the stairs. Her movements trend-like. The picnic, she whispered, her voice trembling. We had a picnic. Right there. We? Arthur asked gently, confused. Eleanor turned to him, her eyes wide and filled with a bewildering mix of terror and wonder. My mother and I, a long, long time ago, before we moved away. I had forgotten. I had completely forgotten this place. She looked back at the cove, her memories seeming to surface like objects from a shipwreck. She brought a blanket and sandwiches cut into star shapes. She told me this was her favorite place in the world. She called it her secret cove. Arthur's blood ran cold. He remembered a line from one of Lena's letters to Daniel. I will show you my secret cove. The one just north of the lighthouse. It's the only place I feel truly myself. Eleanor stumbled towards the stairs, gripping the weathered handrail. Arthur followed, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He didn't understand what was happening, how a memory could surface so violently after so long. She slowly descended the stairs, her eyes scanning the small beach. There was a cave, she murmured, more to herself now, a little one, at the back of the cove where we used to hide from the sun. She pointed towards the cliff face, and there it was, a dark opening in the rock, partially obscured by overgrown seagrass. At that moment, the impossible theory that had been nagging at Arthur solidified into a horrifying, undeniable truth. He looked at Eleanor, truly looked at her, and saw it. The shape of her eyes, the elegant line of her jaw, was all there, a ghostly echo of the vibrant, hopeful woman who had poured her heart out in those letters. Lena hadn't disappeared without a trace. Part of her was standing right here in front of him. Eleanor, he said, his voice thick with emotion. What was your mother's full name? She turned to face him, her expression lost, her mind clearly struggling to connect the past and the present. Helena, she said distraitly. Her name was Helena Blackwood. Helena, a more formal version of Lena. And Blackwood, she had married him. The plan had failed, and she had been forced to marry the man her father had chosen. A wave of pity and rage washed over Arthur. Pity for the young woman whose dreams had been crushed, and rage at the man who had done it. But that didn't explain Eleanor. My father. Eleanor trailed off, her brow furrowed in concentration. My father never came here. He hated the sea. It was always just me and my mother. Arthur took a gentle step towards her. Eleanor, he said, his voice soft but firm. The drawing in the box, the two stick figures on the cliff, holding hands. It was you and your mother, wasn't it? Eleanor's eyes shot to his, a flicker of understanding dawning in their depths. She brought a trembling hand to her iris locket, her knuckles white. I don't know, she stammered. I don't remember drawing it. But Arthur knew. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. This was Lena's daughter, and if her mother had been forced to marry Thomas Blackwood after her plan to escape with Daniel had failed, the timeline was tight. But it was possible, a horrifying possibility. He had to ask the final, terrible question. And your father, he said, holding her gaze. Thomas Blackwood. Was he a good man? Eleanor let out a short, bitter laugh that held no humor. The dreamy, confused look on her face vanished, replaced by a shadow, a hardness that seemed out of place on her gentle features. My father, she said, her voice dropping to a low, cold tone, was a monster. My mother spent her entire life trying to protect me from him. The confession hung in the salty air between them, a truth as raw and brutal as the jagged rocks below. The story was no longer just about lost love, it was about survival. And Arthur was beginning to realize that his quiet, unassuming wife, Clara, had been a soldier in that secret war. The drive back from Port End was heavy with the weight of Eleanor's confession. The revelation had shattered the fragile peace of the day, leaving a landscape of jagged, painful questions in its wake. Eleanor sat staring out the window, her usual serene composure replaced by a tense, troubled stillness. She had retreated into herself, processing a lifetime of fragmented memories that were now coalescing into a coherent, horrifying narrative. Arthur wanted to comfort her, but what could he say? The story belonged to her, a dark inheritance he had unwittingly unearthed. He focused on driving, the familiar rhythm of the road a small comfort in the emotional storm. When they finally returned to the quiet street where Eleanor's shop was, the sun was setting, painting the sky in strokes of bruised purple and melancholy orange. Arthur pulled up to the curb. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, he said gently, breaking the long silence. Eleanor turned to him, her moss-green eyes shadowed with exhaustion. No, she said, her voice stronger than he expected. I think I do. I think I've been carrying this story without knowing its name for my whole life. She invited him in. The shop was dark now, the fading light casting long shadows that made the antiques look like sleeping beasts. Eleanor lit a small lamp on the counter, its warm glow creating an island of intimacy in the gloom. She didn't make tea this time. Instead, she stood behind the counter, her hands resting on the smooth oak surface as if to ground herself. My mother, Helena, was a ghost, she began, her voice low and steady. She was physically present, but her spirit was somewhere else. She floated through our house, this big, opulent prison my father built, with a smile that never reached her eyes. She loved me, I know she did. It was fierce, a desperate kind of love. But there was always a profound sadness in her, a sorrow so deep I could feel it in the room even as a little girl. Arthur listened, his heart aching for the child Eleanor had been, and for the woman he was only now beginning to understand. My father, Thomas Blackwood, was a man who collected beautiful things. Eleanor continued, her voice laced with a cold anger. And my mother was the prize of his collection. He didn't love her. He owned her. He was controlling, manipulative. Our lives were governed by his moods, his rules. He hated when she would speak of her childhood in Port Anne. He called it a sentimental foolishness. That's why our trips to the cove were secrets. They were our small act of rebellion. She paused, her gaze distant. She died when I was 16. A sudden illness, the doctor said. A weak heart. But I know what really killed her. It was a lack of air. A lack of hope. She just faded after she was gone. I couldn't bear to stay. As soon as I turned 18, I took what little my mother had managed to leave me in a private trust. I changed my last name to her mother's maiden name, Betts, and I disappeared. I never looked back. The pieces were clicking into place for Arthur. The escape, the new identity, the desire to be surrounded by old things. Things with stories, perhaps as a way of understanding her own. And Clara, Arthur asked, his voice barely a whisper, where does my wife fit into all of this? Eleanor's gaze softened. Clara was my mother's lifeline. They grew up together, 2 houses down from each other in Port Anne. They were more like sisters than friends. Clara was the practical one, the steady one. My mother was the dreamer. She finally came out from behind the counter and sank into one of the velvet armchairs, pulling a knitted shawl around her shoulders as if a sudden chill had entered the room. I found some of my mother's old diaries after she died. Most of them were filled with melancholy poetry and observations about the weather. But one of them, from the year before she married my father, was different. It was filled with hope. It was filled with D. Arthur's breath caught. Daniel. Yes, Eleanor confirmed. She never used his full name. Just D. The diary spoke of their plans, their dreams, and it was filled with mentions of Clara. Clara, who passed messages between them. Clara, who helped my mother sew money into the hem of a dress. Clara, who stood as a lookout while they met in secret. A picture of his wife formed in Arthur's mind, not the calm, gentle woman who tended her garden, but a brave young co-conspirator, risking the wrath of a powerful man for the sake of her friend's happiness. The diary ends abruptly, Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly. The last entry is just one sentence, written in a shaky, frantic hand. He knows, God help us. He knows, Thomas Blackwood, Arthur breathed. He found out about the escape plan. I think so, Eleanor said, wiping a tear from her eye. The way my mother wrote about it, he didn't just forbid it. He crushed it. He made sure Daniel was gone, and he made sure my mother understood that she had no choice but to marry him. He isolated her from everyone, including Clara. They saw each other only a handful of times after the wedding, always under his watchful eye. Now it all made a terrible kind of sense. Lena Helena had given the box to Clara for safekeeping on the eve of her planned escape. It was their plan B. If Lena made it, she would contact Clara, and the box would be a memento. If she didn't, Clara was meant to find Daniel and give him the letters, to let him know that Lena had loved him, that she hadn't simply abandoned him. But she never gave it to him, Arthur said, the question hanging in the air. Why? Why would she keep it all these years? Maybe she couldn't find him. Eleanor offered. After the lighthouse was automated, he would have had to leave Port Anne. It was 50 years ago. It would have been difficult to track someone down. Or maybe she was scared, Arthur countered, the thought sickening him. Scared of Thomas Blackwood. If he was as ruthless as you say, he might have threatened her, too. Threatened to harm her or her family if she ever tried to contact Daniel. The idea that his wife had lived with that fear, that secret, for their entire marriage was devastating. It recontextualized everything, her quiet nature, her occasional bouts of melancholy he had always attributed to her missing her parents. It was all colored by this shadow from her past. He now understood the box was not a betrayal, but a burden. A heavy, mahogany burden of a promise she couldn't keep. As he sat there, absorbing the weight of it all, his eyes fell upon the box, which was still on the small table. He noticed something he hadn't before. On the inside of the lid, pressed into the wood, was a small, ornate maker's mark. It was the stylized shape of a songbird. Eleanor, he said, his voice quiet. Come look at this. Eleanor leaned over, her eyes squinting in the dim light to see the mark. Her breath hitched in her throat. I've seen that mark before, she whispered, a look of dawning realization on her face. Years ago, on a piece of furniture I was asked to appraise, a beautifully crafted rocking chair. Who made it? Arthur asked, his heart beginning to beat faster. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes wide. I don't remember the name, but I remember the client. It was an old woman who lived in a nursing home just outside of town. She said the chair was a gift, made for her by her brother just before he left Port Anne for good. A new electrifying thread of hope appeared in the tapestry of the story. a brother, a woodworker, a connection however faint to the present day. The story wasn't over. Lena's last wish entrusted to Clara had sat dormant for 50 years. But now, in this quiet antique shop, it felt like it was finally time for the promise to be kept. The following days were a whirlwind of quiet, determined investigation. The shared mission had forged a deep and unexpected bond between Arthur and Eleanor. They were no longer just a grieving widower and a solitary shopkeeper. They were partners, detectives piecing together a history that felt intensely personal to both of them. Their first stop was the Whispering Pines retirement community, the nursing home Eleanor remembered. She had called ahead, her voice calm and professional, explaining that she was an antique appraiser trying to trace the provenance of a unique maker's mark. The receptionist, a cheerful woman named Brenda, was surprisingly helpful. "Oh, you must mean the songbird chair," she'd exclaimed over the phone. "That belonged to Mrs. Gable, Agnes Gable. She passed away 2 years ago, bless her heart. She adored that chair. Said her brother Danny made it for her." Danny, the name echoed in the space between Arthur and Eleanor. Daniel, it had to be him. Brenda informed them that after Mrs. Gubble's passing, her few belongings had been claimed by her nephew, her brother's son. She gave them a name and a last known address in a town about an hour away. The drive was different this time. It wasn't filled with heavy silence, but with a nervous, hopeful energy. "What are we going to say?" Arthur asked, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel. "We can't just knock on the door and announce that his father had a secret love 50 years ago and might have a daughter he never knew about. We start with the box," Eleanor said, her voice steady, though Arthur could see the tension in her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap. "We say we found this box that we believe was made by his father. We're trying to return it to its rightful owner." We let the story unfold naturally. It was a good plan. It was calm, measured. It was Eleanor. The address led them to a modest, well-kept suburban house with a tidy garden and a lovingly painted blue door. A wind chime, carved in the shape of birds, sang a gentle melody from the porch. It felt like a good omen. Arthur took a deep breath and rang the bell. The man who answered the door was in his late 40s. With kind eyes and a welcoming smile, he had the solid, capable look of someone who worked with his hands. "Can I help you?" he asked. Arthur, feeling suddenly tongue-tied, gestured for Eleanor to speak. "Mr. Gable," she began, "my name is Eleanor Vance and this is Arthur Hayes. I know this is highly unusual, but we believe we have something that may have belonged to your father." She held up the canvas bag containing the mahogany box. The man, James Gable, looked surprised, but he opened the door wider. "Please, come in." They sat in a comfortable living room filled with beautifully crafted wooden furniture. A magnificent rocking chair with a familiar songbird crest carved into its headdress sat by the fireplace. James Gubble's workshop was clearly a place of love. "My father is Daniel Gable," James said, after Eleanor had carefully placed the box on the coffee table. "He passed away 5 years ago. I'm afraid you've missed him." The words landed with a quiet thud. They were too late. A wave of disappointment, so sharp it felt like grief, washed over Arthur. All this way, only to find the story's end. Eleanor, however, looked stricken. Her face had gone pale, and she stared at the box as if it were a ghost. She had been so close to finding a piece of her own history, only to have it snatched away. "I'm so sorry to hear that," Arthur said, his voice thick. He felt a fierce, protective urge to shield Eleanor from this new pain. "This is going to sound strange," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly as she composed herself. "But we found this box among the belongings of a recently deceased friend. The craftsmanship is so similar to the chair your Aunt Agnes had. We thought it might be your father's." James leaned forward, his eyes studying the intricate carvings. "My dad was a master craftsman," he said with a sad, proud smile. "He taught me everything I know. He could make wood sing." "May I?" Eleanor nodded. James lifted the lid. He stared at the contents, the pressed iris, the drawing, the stack of letters tied with a red ribbon. He showed no sign of recognition, only a gentle curiosity. "This wasn't my father's," he said finally. "He never mentioned a box like this. And these letters, they're addressed to him, but they're from someone named Lena." He looked up at them, his brow furrowed in confusion. Who was Lena? And so, they told him. They told him the story as they knew it, starting with Arthur finding the box and ending with their trip to the lighthouse. They spoke of Lena Blackwood and her tyrannical father, of the failed escape, of Clara's role as the secret keeper. They left out their suspicions about Eleanor's parentage, sticking only to the facts they could prove. James listened, his expression shifting from confusion to shock, and finally, to a deep, profound sadness. "My God," he whispered when they had finished. "My father, he never spoke of his time in Port Anne. I knew he'd been a lighthouse keeper, but he always said there was nothing there for him. He met my mother a few years later, after he'd left the service. He was a good man, a wonderful father, but there was always a part of him that was distant, a sadness he carried that he would never talk about." He looked down at the letters. "He thought she abandoned him. We think her father intercepted her," Arthur said gently, "and forced her to marry someone else." James ran a hand through his hair. All those years, he lived his whole life thinking the woman he loved just didn't show up. He looked at Eleanor, his kind eyes filled with a sudden, dawning understanding. He had been listening to her voice, watching her face as she spoke of Lena's story. He saw the resemblance she herself was only just beginning to accept. "You said your mother loved blue irises," he said, his voice soft. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. "That was my father's favorite flower," James said, his gaze dropping to the pressed flower in the box. "He planted them all along the walkway to our house. My mother used to tease him about it. He always said they reminded him of the color of the sea on a clear day. It was a small detail, but it was everything. It was the proof. The thread that tied all the pieces together. Lena, with her love for irises, and Daniel, the man who had filled his life with them in her memory." A silence fell over the room, thick with the ghosts of what might have been. And then James did something unexpected. He stood up and walked over to a bookshelf lined with old photo albums. He pulled one down and brought it back to the coffee table. He flipped through the pages, past pictures of his own childhood birthdays, Christmases, family vacations. He stopped at a section in the very back. The photos were black and white, and much older. "These are his photos from his time in the service. And before," James explained. He pointed to a picture of a handsome young man in a keeper's uniform. Squinting in the sun, he was lean and strong, with a kind smile and eyes that seemed to hold a hint of the sadness he would carry for the rest of his life. "That's him," James said. "That's my dad, Daniel." Eleanor stared at the photograph, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch the image of the young man her mother had loved. And then Arthur saw it, tucked into the edge of the plastic sleeve. Behind the photo of Daniel was a tiny, faded picture no bigger than a postage stamp. A photobooth picture of two young women, their heads pressed together, laughing. One was a young, vibrant Eleanor, a girl with hope in her eyes and a secret on her lips. The other, younger, with a steady, kind gaze and a quiet smile, was his Clara. The twist was a knife to his heart. Clara hadn't just been a friend from a few houses down. She had been there. She was a part of the story in a way he had never imagined. This tiny photograph was irrefutable proof of the deep, secret bond the two women shared. He realized Clara hadn't just been keeping Lena's secret, she had been keeping her own. Seeing the photograph of a young, laughing Clara alongside the woman he now knew was Lena Blackwood sent a tremor through Arthur's world. It was one thing to know his wife had kept a friend's secret. It was another to see the visual proof of their shared history, a history from which he had been completely excluded. It felt like a betrayal, a small sharp splinter under the skin of their 48 years together. He kept quiet on the drive back to Eleanor's shop. The image of the two women burned into his mind. James Gable had been kind, overwhelmed but gracious. He had insisted they keep the box and the letters, saying it felt right that they stay with Eleanor. He had asked for her phone number, suggesting that once he had time to process everything, he might like to talk more, to learn about the mother of the sister he never knew he had. It was a new beginning for them, but for Arthur it felt like an ending. He was now an outsider to his own marriage, a latecomer to a story whose most important chapters had been written long before he arrived. "Are you all right?" Eleanor asked, her voice cutting through his troubled thoughts as they pulled up in front of her shop. "You've been quiet." "I'm fine," he said, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. He helped her carry the box back inside. The air in the shop felt different now, charged with resolved mystery and new, complicated emotions. "I don't understand why she never told me," Arthur said, the words finally spilling out as he sank into one of the velvet armchairs. He felt old and tired and very, very lost, not just about Lena and Daniel, but about her part in it, about a friendship so important she would risk so much. "It's like our life together was incomplete." Eleanor looked at him with a deep, knowing sympathy. She didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. Instead, she walked over to a cluttered bookshelf in the corner of the shop. A section filled not with antiques for sale, but with her own personal collection of books on restoration and history. She pulled out a large, leather-bound volume. It was a book on furniture restoration, its pages filled with notes and diagrams. She opened it to the middle. Tucked between the pages was a single, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. It was a letter. "My mother gave this to me when I was a teenager," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "She told me it was from her dearest friend, and that it contained the kind of wisdom a young woman needed to carry with her. I've read it 100 times, but I think it was meant for you, too." She handed the letter to Arthur. His hand shook as he unfolded it. The handwriting was instantly, achingly familiar. It was Clara's. The letter wasn't dated. It was addressed simply, "My dearest Helena, my dearest Helena. I hope this letter finds you well, though I know well is a complicated word in your world. I am writing this from my new home. I am married now, to a good and gentle man named Arthur. He is a woodworker, can you believe it? So quiet and steady. He reminds me sometimes of the goodness I know is in the world. Even when it is hard to see, he makes me feel safe. I know you worry about me, about the promises we made, the secrets we keep. I want you to know that I have the box. It is safe with me. I have not been able to find D. I tried, Helena, I truly did. After you were married and communication became impossible, I went looking for him, but he was gone. The lighthouse was empty. No one knew where he went. I think your father made sure of that. I was so afraid of him, afraid of what he might do if he knew I was looking. So I stopped. I pray that was the right decision. I chose a quiet life. I chose safety. Sometimes I feel like a coward for it. I see you in my dreams sometimes, the young, brave girl who was ready to risk everything for love. And I am the girl who was too scared to even deliver a message. But I want you to know this, and I want your daughter to know it too. If you ever have a chance to tell her, love is not always a grand, daring adventure. Sometimes love is the quiet choice to protect what is precious. It is building a safe harbor in a storm. It is keeping a promise in your heart, even when you cannot fulfill it with your hands. My life with Arthur is my safe harbor. It is not the life of adventure we once dreamed of, but it is a life of deep, quiet love, and I am grateful for it. Do not be sad for me, and do not for a moment think I have forgotten you or him. The box will remain with me a silent testament to the bravest woman I ever knew. Be well, my friend. All my love, Clara. Arthur read the letter twice, the words blurring through his tears. The splinter of betrayal dissolved, replaced by a wave of profound, heartbreaking understanding. She hadn't excluded him. She had protected him. She had built their quiet, happy life as a sanctuary, a deliberate choice to shield him and their marriage from the dangerous shadows of her past. Thomas Blackwood was not a man to be trifled with. Clara had made a choice, not out of cowardice, but out of love for the peaceful life they were building together. He had not been excluded from her heart. He had been the very center of her safe harbor. He looked up at Eleanor, who was watching him with tears in her own eyes. In that moment, he saw not the daughter of a stranger, but the inheritor of his wife's oldest, most fiercely protected loyalty. They were connected, the three of them, by a bond of love and secrets that spanned a lifetime. She was so brave, Eleanor whispered. She was terrified. Arthur corrected her gently. And she did it anyway. That's what bravery is. He carefully folded the letter and handed it back to her. A sense of peace, deep and cleansing, settled over him. The silence in his house was still there, but it no longer felt empty. It felt watchful, full of the quiet strength of the woman who had lived there. He looked around the antique shop, at all the objects imbued with history, with love and with loss. His own life felt like that now, richer, more complex, layered with stories he was only just beginning to understand. Then, his eyes landed on the mahogany box, still sitting on the coffee table. The story felt complete, yet there was one final loose thread. Lena's letter, the one from the night of the planned escape, filled with hope for a garden of blue irises. Daniel had never read it. James Gable, Arthur said, a new resolve in his voice. We need to call him. His father deserves to know. Even now. Eleanor nodded, a small, determined smile gracing her lips for the first time that day. The past was the past, but some messages, she now knew, were never too late to deliver. The next Saturday, Arthur and Eleanor drove back to James Gable's house. This time, they were not arriving as strangers bearing a mystery, but as something akin to distant family, messengers carrying the final chapter of a story that belonged to all of them. James greeted them at the door not with confusion, but with a warm, if somber, welcome. He had been processing the revelations of their last visit, and his kind face was etched with a new, deeper understanding of the father he had loved. He led them to the back of the house, to a beautiful, sun-drenched workshop that smelled of sawdust and varnish. Tools hung in neat, orderly rows above a large workbench. It reminded Arthur so much of his own dormant workshop that a pang of longing went through him. I've been thinking a lot about what you told me, James said, running a hand over a half-finished cabinet. About my dad. It explains so much. The way he'd sometimes just stand at the window looking at nothing. The way he told me to always be honest with the people I love. To never leave things unsaid. He looked at the mahogany box, which Eleanor had placed on the workbench. I went through some of his old things. James continued. In a trunk in the attic, I found this. He held out a small, worn leather-bound journal. It's not a diary, more of a logbook from his time at the lighthouse. Mostly weather observations, maintenance notes, but the last few pages are different. He opened the journal and handed it to Arthur. The entries were dated from the week of the planned escape. The handwriting was strong and clear. October 10th, 1968. The sea is calm tonight. A good omen. 2 more days. It feels like a lifetime. Repaired the lantern mechanism this afternoon. My hands were shaking the whole time. Not from the work. October 11th, 1968. A storm is rolling in from the west. The sky is bruised. I hope it passes by tomorrow night. I cannot bear the thought of a delay. Packed my bag today. It is not much. Everything I need I am waiting for. And then, the final entry. October 13th, 1968. She did not come. The storm passed at sunset, and the sky was clear. I waited until the sun came up. The light put out the stars, and then it put out my hope. There was no message, no sign, just silence. The sea is gray today. So is everything else. Arthur closed the journal, his throat tight. He could feel the young man's heart breaking across the chasm of 5 decades. The stark, simple words were more powerful than any flowery prose. He waited all night, Eleanor whispered, tears welling in her eyes as she read the entry over Arthur's shoulder. Now, Arthur said gently, turning to her, it's time for him to get her last letter. Eleanor took a deep breath. She reached into the box and took out the final letter from Lena, the one filled with so much hope and anticipation. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the brittle paper. In the quiet of the workshop, with the scent of wood shavings in the air and the afternoon sun slanting through the windows, Eleanor began to read her mother's words aloud. Her voice was soft, but it filled the space, a bridge across time. My love, tonight is the night. She read through the whole letter, her voice cracking only once on the line about the garden of blue irises. When she finished, a profound silence settled over the three of them. It was a moment of immense, heartbreaking catharsis. Lena's last message, her final testament of love and hope, had finally been delivered. James wiped a tear from his eye. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for bringing him this. For bringing us this. He looked from Arthur to Eleanor, a new light in his eyes. He would have loved to have known you, he said to Eleanor. He would have been so proud. Later, as they were preparing to leave, James stopped them at the door. My father left me this workshop, all his tools, he said. But he also left me a small plot of land up north. A few acres he bought years ago and never did anything with. He always said he was saving it for something, but he never said what. I think I know now. The unspoken intention hung in the air. It was the land he had dreamed of sharing with Lena. A place for a cottage and a garden. It was a final, devastating piece of the puzzle, a testament to a love that had never truly died. On the drive home, Arthur felt a sense of closure so complete it was almost physical. Clara's burden had been lifted, Lena's message had been delivered, Daniel's memory had been honored. But as one story ended, another, much quieter one was beginning. The bond between him and Eleanor had been forged in the crucible of this shared journey. They had navigated grief, mystery, and revelation together. Now, in the aftermath, a comfortable, easy silence settled between them. My workshop has been quiet for too long, Arthur said, breaking the silence as they neared his street. I think it's time I started making things again. Eleanor smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that made the fine lines around her eyes crinkle. I think that's a wonderful idea, she said. The world needs more beautiful things. A week later, Arthur walked into Eleanor's shop. He was carrying something wrapped in a soft cloth. He had spent the entire week in his workshop, the familiar scent of cedar filling his lungs, the feel of the wood coming alive under his hands a balm to his soul. He had not felt this purposeful, this alive, since before Clara had gotten sick. I have something for you, he said, his heart beating a little faster than usual. He placed the object on the counter and unwrapped it. It was a small box, crafted from light, golden maple. The joinery was perfect, the finish smooth as silk. On the lid, he had carved a single, perfect blue iris. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes filled with tears. Arthur, she whispered, it's beautiful. Open it, he urged. She lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of blue velvet, was not a pressed flower or an old letter, but a single small brass key. It was the key to his house. I know it soon, Arthur said, his voice a little shaky. And I know we both have pasts that are complicated and full of ghosts. But my house has been silent for too long, and I find I enjoy the sound of your voice more than the quiet. Eleanor looked from the key to his face, her expression a mixture of shock and radiant joy. She didn't say anything. Instead, she came around the counter, stood on her toes, and pressed a soft, gentle kiss to his lips. It was a kiss that tasted of chamomile tea and second chances. It wasn't the fiery, desperate passion of Lena and Daniel's stolen moments. It was something else, something quieter, deeper. A love built not on a frantic escape, but on a slow, steady journey home. It was the love of a safe harbor, a place to rest after a long, unexpected storm. And for the first time in a very long time, Arthur Hayes felt like he was finally home. Months melted into a comfortable, gentle rhythm. The key Arthur had given Eleanor was no longer just a symbol. It was a part of her daily life. She didn't move into the house on Chestnut Street. Her little apartment above the shop was too much a part of her identity to abandon, but she filled the quiet spaces in Arthur's home with her presence. There was the soft scent of her chamomile tea in the kitchen in the evenings, a stack of her books on the nightstand in the guest room which had slowly become her room, and the sound of her laughter mingling with the ticking of the grandfather clock. The silence that had once haunted Arthur was gone, replaced by the easy cadence of companionship. They spent their days in a comfortable tandem. Arthur was back in his workshop, the hum of his lathe and the scrape of his sanding blocks a constant, reassuring presence. He wasn't just building furniture, he was reclaiming a part of himself. He restored an old rocking chair for the nursery of a young couple down the street. He built a set of magnificent bookshelves for the local library, his songbird maker's mark hidden discreetly on the back of a shelf. Each piece was an act of quiet joy. Eleanor, in turn, found a new energy in her own work. The story of the box had reaffirmed her belief in the power of objects to hold history. to connect lives. She began hosting small workshops at her store, teaching people how to care for their family heirlooms, sharing not just the techniques of restoration, but the importance of preserving the stories the objects held. She kept in close contact with James Gable. Their relationship was a delicate, unfolding thing. They were strangers connected by the deepest of roots. They exchanged long emails, then graduated to phone calls. He told her stories of his father, of Daniel's quiet integrity and unexpected humor. She, in turn, shared the few precious memories she had of her mother, painting a picture of the woman Lena had been beyond her tragic love story. One sunny afternoon in late autumn, James came to visit. He and Eleanor asked Arthur to join them. The three of them sat in Arthur's garden, the one Clara had so lovingly tended, the late-blooming roses still clinging to their vibrant color. "I did it," James announced, a nervous excitement in his voice. "I went up to see the land my dad left me." He pulled a photograph from his jacket pocket. It showed a few acres of rolling green land, bordered by a stand of tall pine trees. In the distance, you could just make out the glint of a lake. "It's beautiful," Eleanor said, her voice soft. "It is," James agreed, "and while I was there, I decided something. It shouldn't just sit empty." He looked from Eleanor to Arthur, his expression earnest. "I want to build a small cabin there, a retreat, and I want to plant a garden." He paused, taking a deep breath. "A garden of blue irises, a whole field of them. It feels like the right way to honor them all. Lena and Daniel, a place of peace where their story can finally rest." The gesture was so profound, so perfect, that for a moment, neither Arthur nor Eleanor could speak. It was the ending Lena had written for herself, finally coming to pass through the hands of the children she had never been able to unite. "But," James continued, a sheepish smile on his face, "I've inherited my father's love of wood, but not all of his skill. I could use some help. A master's touch." He looked directly at Arthur. "I was hoping you'd be willing to help me design it. Maybe even help with the fine details, the cabinetry, the window frames. We could put a songbird carving over the door." Arthur was stunned. The offer was more than just a request for help, it was an invitation. An invitation into the final, healing act of the story. It was a chance to use his own skills, the very essence of who he was, to bring beauty and closure to the lives that had so unexpectedly intertwined with his own. He looked at Eleanor. Her eyes were shining with unshed tears, and she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I would be honored," Arthur said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't quite name. It was gratitude and humility and a deep, abiding sense of peace. The project became their shared focus through the winter and into the spring. Designs were drawn up on Arthur's kitchen table. James would drive down on weekends, and the three of them would work, first in Arthur's shop, crafting window frames and a beautiful front door from warm, honey-colored oak, and later, on the land itself as a small foundation was laid. Arthur had never felt more vital. The work gave him purpose, and the easy camaraderie he shared with James and Eleanor was a gift he had never expected to receive at this stage of his life. One crisp spring evening, after a long day of working on the cabin, the three of them were sitting on the new front porch, watching the sunset paint the lake in hues of fire. The frame of the house was up, and the scent of fresh-cut pine was intoxicating. All around the cabin, in the freshly turned earth, were hundreds of newly planted iris bulbs, their green shoots just beginning to poke through the soil. "She would have loved this," Eleanor said quietly, leaning her head on Arthur's shoulder. "He would have, too," James added, his voice content. Arthur looked at the two of them, this brother and sister who had found each other through a 50-year-old mystery, and his heart felt full. He thought of Clara. He no longer felt the sting of her secrets, only a profound sense of awe at the life she had lived, at the fierce loyalty she had held in her quiet heart. He realized that Clara hadn't just left him a house and a collection of memories. She had, in her own mysterious way, left him this. She had left him Eleanor. She had left him a new family, a new purpose. She had left him the end of a beautiful, tragic story, and the beginning of a new one. As darkness fell and the first stars began to appear in the vast, silent sky, Arthur reached for Eleanor's hand, his calloused fingers slicing through hers. He thought of the two boxes, the dark, mahogany box of secrets that had started it all, and the light, maple box of hope that he had crafted for Eleanor. Life, he mused, was a series of such boxes. Some were meant to be locked away, their contents too heavy to carry, but others were meant to be opened, their stories shared, their keys offered with a trusting heart. He held Eleanor's hand a little tighter, feeling the steady warmth of her presence beside him. The cabin wasn't finished, and the irises had not yet bloomed, but in the peaceful quiet of the evening, surrounded by the promise of what was to come, Arthur Hayes felt a sense of completion so pure and so profound. It was a quiet prayer of thanks whispered into the twilight.